Have you ever wondered why they don't bomb cities anymore, but can still bring them to their knees? For most of history, when an empire wanted to break a city, it would surround the walls and wait. Today, however, and this is where it gets critical, it's pointing to the banking system, shipping routes, insurers, oil buyers, and currency channels. The weapon changed, but the logic never did. Modern powers no longer need to bomb a refinery, blockade a harbor, or seize a capital to inflict pain. They can choke access to reserves, freeze payments, threaten ship owners, scare insurers, blacklist buyers. And most importantly, they can make entire economies harder to finance. How are sanctions sold to you? Diplomacy, legal measures, perhaps a bit of moral pressure. But when you strip away the polite language, what emerges is an older and much harsher reality. Siege warfare masterfully translated into the infrastructure of modern finance and trade. Now let me ask you a question. What is the real purpose of a siege? Most of you will say, to destroy the enemy. But you're wrong. A siege is not fundamentally about destroying a target in one blow. The real point is this: make normal life impossible long enough that the target bends, breaks, or comes to the bargaining table. What was the formula in the ancient and medieval world? Cut the food roads, block water access, close reinforcement routes. And how do economies survive in the modern world? Through circulation, of course. Dollar payments, reserve access, marine insurance, export earnings, commodity sales, port access, banking relationships. If you can constrict these flows, and note this carefully, you don't need to conquer territory right away. You can pressure a state by strangling the systems it depends on to function. That's exactly why sanctions have moved to the center of modern power projection. They're not targeting a city's walls. They're targeting an economy's arteries. Does that make them clean? Quite the opposite. It makes them disturbingly familiar. Let me give you a historical truth. Old sieges were rarely precise. Rulers framed them as pressure on enemy governments or garrisons. But who suffered? The civilians who starved, fled, smuggled, and buried the dead. Modern sanctions work with the same logic of indirect pain. They're sold to you as targeted tools against elites, regimes, or war machines. In reality, they work by frightening banks, insurers, shipping firms, refineries, commodity traders, and even neutral third parties into cutting ties. Have you ever looked at the U.S. Treasury Department's sanctions guidance for maritime trade? You can clearly see what's happening in practical terms. Oil cargoes, shipping documents, vessel transfers, insurers, beneficial owners, payment chains, all become parts of the battlefield. In other words, the modern siege is built from compliance departments and risk committees as much as from warships. Think about that for a moment. So, how is this possible? Because the modern global economy, and this is critical, is unusually centralized in a few systems that powerful states can influence. The dollar still dominates trade invoicing and global finance. Major insurers and clearing channels remain deeply exposed to Western legal systems. Energy, shipping, and commodity markets still depend on relatively few choke points and service providers. You know what that means? Exclusion really hurts. If a bank fears losing dollar access, if an insurer worries about sanctions risk, if a shipping company is anxious about its vessels being blacklisted, commerce can be suffocated without a single customs officer physically seizing the goods. Sanctions became the new siege warfare because modern trade isn't just physical, it's also legal, financial, and insurable. And these layers are much easier for powerful states to weaponize than many people realize. Now let me tell you something. The historical comparison matters because it helps us cut through the propaganda. Why do states prefer sanctions today? Because they look more civilized than bombing campaigns. Administrative, rules-based, almost surgical in precision. But what's their logic? Deeply pre-modern. The formula is simple. Isolate the target, cut supply, reduce endurance, force internal stress, and wait. The only difference: the old besieger blocked grain. The modern besieger blocks settlement, insurance, spare parts, export earnings, and access to foreign exchange. The pressure is slower, often deniable, and mediated through market actors. But the goal is the same. Make the target spend more, earn less, import less, and strain its political system from within. If you want to understand the mechanics, think about it this way. Start with exports. If a sanctioned state can't easily sell oil, metals, arms, or other core exports, what happens? Foreign earnings weaken. If foreign earnings weaken, reserves come under pressure. If reserves come under pressure, the local currency becomes fragile. A weaker currency makes imports more expensive. And at this point, the domino effect begins. Shipping insurers, freight firms, and banks become cautious. Costs rise further. Trade gets rerouted. Middlemen take bigger margins. Smuggling increases. Corruption expands. Domestic shortages become more likely. Controlling inflation gets harder. See it? Sanctions don't need to destroy production directly. They just need to make it harder to move, sell, pay for, or ensure the output. When the target is deeply integrated into the broader system, they become such an effective coercive tool. But this is also where the mythology begins. Sanctions are presented to you as precision weapons. In reality, just like old sieges, they're extremely blunt around the edges and ruthless in transmission. Even when formal exemptions exist for food, medicine, or humanitarian goods, financial institutions and logistics providers pull back out of fear, compliance cost, or uncertainty. The result? A deep chasm between what the sanctioning power calls exempt and what the real economy can still deliver. The public story says targeted pressure. The operational story shows chilled commerce. Every siege in history claimed to pressure rulers. Every siege also reached civilians. Modern sanctions are not an exception. Now let's move to another dimension. Why are sanctions so dependent on third parties? Classic military sieges worked by directly encircling the target. Modern sanction sieges work by forcing everyone around the target to recalculate their own survival. That's where the power of secondary sanctions lies. The target isn't just the sanctioned country, it's every bank, refinery, trader, insurer, port, or ship owner deciding whether continued contact is worth the risk of being cut off from the larger system. Writers showed this clearly in U.S. measures related to Iran. The pressure extends beyond Iran itself to buyers, transport networks, and service providers. The weapon isn't just punishment, it's forced choice. You're presented with this dilemma. Stay connected to the target and risk exclusion from the core, or abandon the target and preserve access to the larger market. This is siege logic in its purest, most ruthless form. But here's where things get really interesting, because every siege has a limit. The besieger must be able to endure the collateral damage long enough to crack the target first. This was true when armies had to keep their own supply lines open outside city walls. It's still true when sanctions collide with oil markets, shipping routes, and inflation. Let me give you a real example. Reuters reported that in March and April 2026, as the Iran war and Hormuz disruption tightened supply and drove up prices, the United States issued temporary waivers touching certain Russian and Iranian oil-linked flows. You understand? The state using sanctions had to bend them because the broader energy system was under too much stress. European allies objected in the Russian case because easing oil pressure undercut the broader strategy. Does this mean sanctions don't work? No. It means siege warfare always forces a second question. How much pain can the attacker endure while maintaining it? And this is the moment when oil changes everything. When sanctions target a weak financial flow or a narrow technology channel, they look morally clear. When they collide with a commodity the world still desperately needs, they become much messier. If oil supply is already tight, if shipping routes are under stress, if inflation is politically dangerous, sanctioning powers discover this. Strangling the target also means importing pain through fuel costs, insurance premiums, and allied economic strain. Reuters' reporting on the Gulf War showed exactly this. Even while the broader sanctions architecture remained in place, waivers were used as emergency tools to calm markets. Siege warfare looks very neat in a strategy memo. When the besieger's own consumers start paying more for energy, that neat appearance turns into an advantage. Now let's look at the Chinese refineries episode, because this sharpens the situation even further. Reuters reported on May 2, 2026, that China's Ministry of Commerce took a significant step. A blocking order was issued instructing Chinese entities not to recognize, enforce, or comply with U.S. sanctions imposed on 5 Chinese refineries tied to Iranian oil. What does this mean? Anti-sanctions law was being used as a counterweapon. But the story doesn't end there. Reuters reported something else interesting a few days later. Chinese regulators asked major banks to pause new yuan loans to these sanctioned refiners. See this contradiction? This is the modern sanctions battlefield in miniature. Publicly, China rejects the legitimacy of U.S. measures. Behind the scenes, Chinese authorities continue to manage the exposure and pressure they've created. What's the lesson here? Not that sanctions are irrelevant, that sanctions now provoke counter-sanctions frameworks, legal shields, and domestic damage control. Not a single clean line of punishment, but a full contest of competing coercive systems. That's why sanctions should be understood as siege warfare, not magic. They're powerful because the world is still connected enough for exclusion to hurt. The target suffers, but it's not alone. Neighboring economies, neutral traders, allied importers, and sometimes the sanctioning power itself also suffer. The more central the targeted commodity or financial channel, the harder it becomes to maintain clean pressure without broader blowback. Can sanctions degrade a rival's endurance? Yes. Can they force costly workarounds? Absolutely. Can they shrink revenue and harden dependency? Of course. But they rarely remain contained, and when energy, inflation, and systemic stability enter the picture, they rarely stay purely moral. That's why the present moment is unusually revealing. Today's sanctions environment shows both the reach and the limit of modern economic coercion. Shipping guidance is getting more detailed. Oil transport networks are being targeted. Secondary sanctions loom over buyers. In response, anti-sanctions laws and blocking orders are emerging. Even when governments strike defiant postures, banks, insurers, and refiners behave cautiously. Meanwhile, when the sanctioning coalition starts feeling too much pain, waivers appear. Is this the end of sanctions? No. It's their maturation into a full-spectrum siege tool, a fully fledged weapon operating through finance, law, energy, logistics, and fear. Let me tell you the deeper rule. Old sieges controlled food, roads, water, and morale. Modern sanctions control reserves, insurers, payment rails, ship owners, commodity buyers, and access to core markets. The walls are gone. But dependency? It came and never left. Great powers learned something important in a world built on circulation. You don't always need to seize territory to squeeze a rival. You just need to control the systems through which the rival earns, pays, imports, and settles. That's why sanctions became the new siege warfare. In an age where access itself is power, they operate as the coercion of access. And here's the final lesson. Sanctions are not a clean moral tool. They are siege warfare translated into banking, insurance, shipping, reserves, oil flows, payment systems, and market access. Like every siege in history, they don't just pressure the target, they pressure everyone connected to the target. They can be devastating, but never perfectly targeted. They can be strategic, but never costless. The weapon changed, the logic did not. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe, because history has all the answers, and we'll see together where to look. See you next time.